All right. Well, good morning,
Yeah.
everybody. I'm glad to see you all here this morning. Just remember, if we had some conversations, just please turn off your mics until we get through the presentation, and then we'll kind of go from there. So as Phil mentioned, we are in our last week. So here we're dealing with the topic of bioethics, issues, and options. So there's so much in this topic. So my goal this week is really a modest one. I feel like that with a lot of the weeks, right? You can't cover all the issues at once, but my primary goal is to just provoke you to think biblically, to challenge all the way you've thought and have been trained in this post-Christian America. A lot of us, again, I've mentioned, haven't grieved the fact that we're in post-Christian America. So the Christian, biblical, Judeo-Christian worldview that was the presupposition in the soil which everything was moved and rooted in and grew out of, now it's totally different, and that's just not the way folks think anymore. So it's very important that we learn to think biblically. So again, my goal is to expose the current worldview assumptions in a post-Christian world, and then to provide guiding principles for decision making. Not a hey, do this particular thing in this particular situation, although sometimes it's obvious, other times it's not. The goal is God holds us accountable, right, to the order and summary of the entire Bible is to love the Lord thy God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Number one, love your neighbor as yourself. And we all reverse that order a lot, and that can get us in trouble. And it's a little bit presumptuous because it makes us believe that we can love people who are made in God's image better than God can, whose very nature and essence is love. So it causes us to do things like, well, did God really say, right? So my focus today I'm going to kind of bookend it a little bit, honestly, just the beginning of life decisions and the end of life decisions on the guiding principles. Since most of us will have to deal with these things both directly or indirectly through wise counsel, as maybe young couples are looking to have children and are struggling to have children, or your aging parents, and you have those decisions kind of come upon you. That's a tough one. I've been in those situations myself, and just grateful to know that I have some thoughts beforehand to ask good questions and ask the right questions. I just can't punt the decision to the doctor. I need to ask good questions. And forgive me, but there is a generational thing. I think the boomers who grew up in that kind of Christian context as the transition was just beginning have a tendency just to trust media as a default, or trust the doctor authority. And that's something that you just can't do by default anymore. So that's my goal. Again, my goal is a modest one. So let's start by giving God the first word before we get into it. Just such a wonderful psalm. For you created, for you created or formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all written the days ordained for me, when yet there was not one of them. So the whole purpose of this, right, is the scriptures are telling us that God is sovereign over life, right? The beginning and end. We may have mistakes, if you will, like my dad may have proposed to my mom in high school by saying, "You're having a what?" But there are no mistakes in God's sovereignty. The sin is kind of woven into his overall plan and how he works through this. And it's just a wonderful thing to know that every life is precious to God, the beginning of it and end of it, because he is sovereign over it. So this gets into the worldview assumptions when we address any of these issues when it comes to bioethics, right? From a Christian worldview perspective, there's an assumption, right? The truth that there is a creator, and then thus we are his creation. And a secular humanist, Neo-Marxist worldview, well, there is no creator. And I really got into that last week, and I read from some of my college textbooks. the worldview assumptions from a Christian perspective is that humankind was specially created. So we are different from the animals, right? God breathed life into us with this divine kiss, if you will, and it makes us something different, right? We are a body-soul composite. Whereas the secular humanistic Neo-Marxist worldview perspective is that humans evolved from animals. So you went from infantile to reptile to gentile, if you will. God is sovereign over life, right? When there is a God, you know that you're in submission to that and that you're looking at a creation that's designed. When you're have a secular worldview, right? You know you're sovereign over life. Totally different way of thinking. This is an undercurrent. This is the philosophical thinking. Well, there's a sanctity of life is a key principle that all life matters, all right? All humans who are made in God's image, that's your guiding principle for how you treat people. And no, secular humans said, no, the quality of life is a key principle, right? So there's a utilitarian approach to ethics, which we talked about in week 2. And this again goes to the utilitarian. No, the end does not justify the means. God, who is just and loving and all these things work together, require of us just means toward a just end. Loving means toward a loving end. And it's not mere sentimentalism. It's self-sacrificial and it's unconditional. So there's a sacrifice that we make for others because Jesus set the example by making it for us. In the secular worldview, nope, the end justify the means. You kind of can start from there. So let's start with the beginning of life with one of my favorite pictures. I still remember the day I saw this on Life magazine, and Lord knows it would never be there again. But this picture right here is such a beautiful picture. So here's a child getting a surgery, 21 weeks old. And to the doctor's surprise, as he's trying to close up the mother, the baby reaches out and grabs his finger. And it's such an amazing, tender moment that was caught on picture. It's a beautiful picture. And this is really important because as we get into any types of issues, right, you'll hear things like, it's so funny, like everyone talks, all of a sudden uses a medical term, you hear the word, everyone starts talking about fetus. It's a fetus when you don't want it. It's a baby when you want it. And you don't get to arbitrarily determine those things. And this is a child's a baby. So all of a sudden we started talking all medically. So when you do things like that, what you're doing is you're hiding. It's a dehumanizing approach to it. And then you'll hear terms like the fallacy of ambiguity. You'll see this when the stem cell research, right? Well, that's ambiguous. No. Are you talking about fetal stem cell research where the child is merely a utilitarian tool to our ends? Or are you talking about adult stem cells or the stem cells that you can get out of an umbilical cord? It's unbelievable we can get out of. That's research. But they just say, no, someone's against stem cell research. No, it's what do you mean by those terms? And it's really important. And then if you have something like, for example, you're trying to have children and you go down to, the in vitro fertilization and the doctor will say to you something like, well, now you have 3 fertilized eggs. It's time for selective reduction. Oh, you mean killing 2 to 3 children, so you have 1. And then what do you get to do? Pick, I'll have the boy or I'll have the girl. You see, those kind of terms, anytime there's cuddly terms or something like that, the question you have to ask is, what is it hiding in the evil in the human heart? Ours too. We are fallen, we are saved, but we are still fallen. So I'll give you an example. What if I did something like this, right? And I said, okay, hey, in a few seconds, 4 seconds, this video is going to start. Your initial heart reaction to me putting this up and thinking that a video is going to start tells you everything you know about what you believe is actually true, because the moral law is written on our heart. Abortion is a human rights issue. It is not a woman's rights issue. So you answer that fundamental question, then every situational question kind of falls into place when you have that one as primacy. So I like to remind people that if Jesus had an ancestry.com account, right? Anyone, if you ever done an ancestry.com, sometimes you pop on and you get surprised at a family member who done all this research and you start seeing all these, family lineages, and it'll stop in certain areas and so forth based upon information or lack of information. Well, if Jesus had an account, he would see in his lineage the sins of incest and a prostitute and 2 Gentiles that are in his lineage. Chapter 1 in Matthew, the book of Matthew, we're here talking about Christmas. If you look at chapter 1 in Matthew, it lists Rahab, who was a prostitute who saved the Jewish spies. In Joshua chapter 2, and her grandson, you have Boaz and his wife, Ruth, who was, quote, the Moabite. Well, where did the Moabites come from? Well, read Genesis 19, and you find out where the Moabites came from. It seems you can take Lot and his family out of Sodom and Gomorrah, but you can't take Sodom and Gomorrah out of Lot and his family. So I discovered this when I was on staff at McLean Bible Church, and we had a wonderful ministry. It was called Forgiven and Set Free. And it was just a wonderful ministry that was led by a woman who had had an abortion and went through all these things during times of the birthday or when she was due, and she would go through depression, and she had trouble, postpartum depression, attaching to her first child. She went through these issues for a long time, came to Christ and hid that in shame, that kind of shame response, but came to this realization gratefully and thankfully that Jesus bore our shame. The cross was a symbol of shame, and that he forgives that too. And when she allowed him into that space and became really, truly restored, she started a ministry. I love it. It was her So That ministry, right? The things and the comfort that God gave her, this is 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians 1, she was able to then pour out to others. And lots of ladies would go through this process. Well, one of the pastors who's kind of like a walking heart of McLean Bible, Richard Park, was doing some of the services. So they would end with a service where the ladies would light a candle and name the child. So I wanted to participate in this to really connect and kind of bring my heart to it, right? Remember, I told you I came to Christ head first. I always wanted to try to connect my heart to these issues and the people. So I went and did that. I tell you what, it was an unbelievable experience for me. So a couple ladies, both over 30 years, had abortions. And these ladies didn't cry, they wailed. But it was so healing and cleansing for each of them. And I remember that it's really a human rights issue because I run into a man in Starbucks. I used to do Bible study there, and I'd pray over my Bible study in time that I'd be a good witness. If God wanted to open a door, he would. And he only did it one time. And I'd run into a brother once in a while or a sister, say, hey, good to see you out here. But one time we're a gentleman who was just so distraught. And I just saw he was distraught, and he just popped over and sat down literally and found out that his girlfriend had aborted his child, and he had no idea. And he was he didn't know how to even process it, right? So again, all that's to say that, man, if you don't call a spade or walk in truth, you're going to be struggling, and you're going to have your whole heart kind of turned upside down if you don't deal with those things appropriately and biblically. God wants into that space, friends. He wants into that space. So let him in, and you watch what he does with that ministry. So those were those things. And I can tell you right now that I've convinced 0 people by doing an intellectual debate on a topic. I went to abortionno.org and I ordered some little business cards, and I put them in my wallet. And I'm 2 for 2 for winning people to the pro-life side using these cards. And the cards are pictures of aborted children at 9 and 11 weeks. And what I do is I grab my wallet when someone brings up a topic, I lay it on a table. So what if I told you I had pictures of aborted babies in there? Would you be able to look at it? And you see the pause. I go, that pause tells you everything you need to know. And I had 2 take the challenge. And my one friend literally said, man, bro, you trying to make me cry? I go, no way. If it makes your heart tender, like mine was hard. Yes, I hope so. So again, the beginning of life issues, and be real careful as you're kind of going through, you're ministering to young couples or your daughter or son, or you yourself are in a situation and you're waiting on the Lord's timing and all those types of things and seeing what he has for you. Just be wise in those decisions, right? That's really my heart in that. So let's go to the next topic, right? So when you get into these things, right, as far as human beings, right, there is an assumption. One is called materialism. And no, I'm not talking about those of you who are in Tyson's 2. That's a different kind of materialism, right? I show up Tyson's 2, not Tyson's 1. No, that's a different type of materialism. What I'm talking about is that you're a material substance only, right? There's a presupposition that the medical community, everyone's being trained in, right? Again, that we're infantile, reptile, Gentile, that the brain is the mind, right? Or that your personality, emotions, there's really no free will at all. All that's just determined. And it gets into all kinds of issues, even in evolutionary psychology and all those types of things, right? So you're kind of like destined to things. And that's just not true at all. The biblical model, and what neuroscience has demonstrated, by the way, is that no, you're a body, soul, or body spirit composite, right? There are physical traits and physical properties you have, but there's also metaphysical properties that cannot be merely reduced to chemical reactions. Obviously, you'll see a chemical reaction, but you can't just make love a chemical. What if I told my wife, well, only reason why I loved you is that I had this kind of chemical reaction and these synapses fired when I saw you. So that's all it is. That's a reductive fallacy. You don't reduce something complex as emotions to merely a physical property, right? They kind of work, it's called an interactionist kind of approach. They work hand in hand. What happens with your soul and in your mind, emotions impacts your body. Some of you are really stressed right now during this season, or if you're in accounting, right? The tax season closed now. I had a very stressful week. Stress isn't good. My body craves unhealthy things, sugar for some dopey reason. So during this time when I'm dealing with stress, so stress can give you ulcers, right? All those types of things. So they work hand in hand. So that really leads us to an important point I just want to lay out, right? That neuroscientists embrace dualism because of these properties, right? I want to prove to you some of the most brilliant scientists embrace this dualist approach. So Charles Sherrington is the father of neuroscience itself. Then we have Charles Sherrington, who's considered, forgive me, we have Charles Sherrington's the father of neuroscience, and Wilder Penfield. He himself is considered the father of modern epilepsy surgery. Then there's Sir John Achilles, who's a Nobel laureate in medicine for this groundbreaking work on the functioning of neurosynapses. And then finally, we have Jeffrey Schwartz, who's a UCLA neurologist and neuroscientist, and he documented evidence that that mental states, i.e. the mind, shows measurable changes in brain function, this kind of separation but interlinked with the two. So kind of cool. I'll give you some good resources at the end of this for all this, so that I think you'll find it fascinating. So let's get into another compare and contrast chart, right? So once we have the worldview assumptions, right, where we come from, that we're created or evolved, and what all those things mean, that we're sovereign over life, that God's sovereign over life, it brings into then, what do you do? How do you approach these issues, right? Well, the Christian view is we approach it that we're serving God. And a secular humanist, Neo-Marxist view says, no, they're playing God, right? Because God doesn't exist, so it's a small g God. So anything, right, and from a Christian perspective, well, there's voluntary treatment versus compulsory treatment. You're starting to see this a little bit, aren't you? Then from a Christian worldview, it's about improving human life. And in a secular humanist world, no, it's about creating human life. Of course, they always have to have God's blueprints and God's material. So go get your own material. So you're not really creating a human life, but that's their perspective, right? And it's called like this kind of this AI kind of humanism kind of thing. It's just not going to happen. So then there's repairing human life. So it's about repairing this fallen world, this fallen creation. No, here it's about recreating human life. And there's these hybrid pigs and trying to find creatures to kind of become almost like an organ harvest place for us. And, in the West, just to show how much we have a secular humanistic neo-Marxist context, we outsource all of these types of things to countries that will do it and don't have the Judeo-Christian framework that's still within some of the laws. And I think that's unfortunate. The Christian view has a maintenance of life perspective. You see the difference? Whereas this is an engineering of life perspective. From a Christian worldview, I know serving God, right? It's about genetic fitness, right? The fall impacted the body, the mind. So everything's about fitness, right? But when you're doing like gene therapy, all those types of things is about genetic fitness, not genetic fabrication and implementing kind of foreign objects into the whole programming language, if you will. The Christian view is about, cooperating with nature, right? It's God's creation. And no, the secular perspective is about control over nature. The Christian worldview, again, the principles kind of come with this conformity to nature, how God created things, and you bring it back to its proper form. Whereas no, the secular humanists, like the doors are open. It's about power over nature, and because it can be done, it ought to be done. Because it can be done, it should be done. So that is quite a different perspective. So hopefully you see these principles, this worldview, as you're kind of approaching these topics. This is the assumption. A lot of these are philosophical assumptions that folks are trained in. There's a worldview that comes at rest, and then all of a sudden from there, principles are derived on how you deal with situations. So let's kind of talk about that a little bit. So here, as far as principles go, you have a biblical view, right, where you have these moral principles. This is called a top-down approach that's rooted in the moral law, that's written on law, written on heart. So some of those principles are principles of autonomy, where you have the right over your own life and your own body, right? The principle of I have trouble with this word, so you all have to forgive me. Non-maleficence, right? It's the obligation to avoid harming or injuring others, and this is rooted in a Hippocratic oath, which is one of the oldest principles in the medical world. It says, "I will," quote, "I will never use treatment to injure or wrong the sick." Then there's the principle of beneficence, right? Forgive me, I'm bad at these words. That it's a moral obligation to act toward the benefit of others. You see this? This is an others-centric approach. And that is a principle of justice, right? Meaning that there's an impartial judgment rooted in the fact that all people are created in the image of God, and they deserve treatment, they deserve care, period, no matter what status is in your life. And then those kind of, what happens with those, right, is that drives a top-down approach. You take that as a framework on how you then deal with specific cases, specific situations. This is called principlism. And this has been a guiding kind of training from the very beginning as you go into science or any of these type of medical fields, whatever they are. That was the main guiding goal. Well, now we've kind of added this other one, right, where it's called casuistry. And this is a bottom-up approach. And it kind of operates almost like case law. And it leads to this consequentialist approach or this utilitarian approach. And it uses factors such as not sanctity of life, but quality of life, not cost to the person, but financial cost of care, not burdensome on the individual who's made in God's image, but burdensome on society or the system. That approach is totally different. That's a bottom-up approach. You take these specific situations or the specific case, and then you kind of build a case law to it. And you kind of, again, from a utilitarian perspective, you look at it as a group and you kind of come up with, oh, well, here's consensus on how you take care of these things. I don't know about you, but I don't want a truth determined by a majority of vote of sinners, whether they're baptized or not. So, and that's been the leaning on, hey, this is a better approach. And this is kind of where we're at today. And it's important to understand that really, again, our university system are nothing but seminaries of secularism. So thank goodness we have a school like Liberty where they have a huge medical program that's very well thought out. And I'm going to introduce you to a great resource by one of the professors there who I had in bioethics at my seminary. So let's go to this specific situation. See, I went down from philosophical worldview. I went down from principles and how you kind of look at things, and then specific cases. So let's talk about a specific case. A lot of you guys have heard this, and this is when we get into the end of life kind of things, right? You hear this term euthanasia. Well, again, it's so important in our cultural context to add, well, what do you mean by that term? The term is really comes from two Greek words that kind of splashed together, and it means literally good death. Well, there's two forms, right? So again, don't fall into the fallacy of just hearing the word without what do you mean by it. Well, there's the biblical view, which is releasing life, right? God is sovereign over life, right? God giveth, God taketh away, that kind of approach to it. Whereas the secular humanist and neo-Marxist view is no, it's about taking life. Man is sovereign, again, because of utility. So that utilitarian approach to individuals and seeing them as groups. Then the biblical view is no, when you talk about a good death, it's passive because technology has been both a blessing and a curse, right? So this passive approach, right, where you're allowing the natural death process to occur. And if any of you have been in end of life situations like myself, man, if you haven't thought about this beforehand, it just plays on you when you get hit with it at the moment. So then there's the secular humanist neo-Marxist view, which is an active euthanasia, which is the causing death. Like, you do this specific thing that causes death. Well, that is not a biblical approach to these issues. Now you take the two together, you have this, what's called the principle of double effect. Well, of course, you might allow the natural death to occur, but that may be from stopping a life support system that's going nowhere. And that kind of gets into this other issue. And you're going to have to deal with these and figure out what the heck do you do with them. So let's see. So here is kind of a biblical approach to kind of passive release guidelines. Again, guidelines. You're going to have to sift the situations through it. Lord knows I am not going to play some sort of expert on this particular thing. And you shouldn't either, and you shouldn't punt your responsibility to the quote expert in the white coat. You need to think through these things and noodle through these things so that you're being just for a person who cannot speak for themselves. So let me give you these principles, and this comes from Christianity and Bioethics. I'll show you this at the end, so don't worry about squinting to see it, from Mark Foreman. So the principles are that the patient is terminal, that death is imminent, or treatment is futile, right? So you can see where the questions come in. Like, someone will pop in and say, it's terminal, death is imminent, treatment is futile. Is that true? You just got to ask the question, is that true? And just kind of noodle through it and hopefully get some wise counsel from brothers and sisters in the Lord. Treatment is excessively burdensome. Burdensome to who? To the person, right? Which really the passive approach is, no, it's to the person. This is compared to the person's benefit, right? Is it burdensome, the treatment, as far as, does that outweigh the benefit or the outcome that's expected? And that's a tough one to noodle through too, right? None of these are easy, but these are at least principles, guiding principles. Death is not intended by whatever action occurs, right? So it's not the direct cause, but that the principle of double effect, right? That may end up happening. Well, that's fine, right? So it's tough. And when you're in these situations, it's a very interesting thing that happens. And they actually have a term for it, which I had never heard this until we dealt with this with Cheryl's mom. I'd never heard this term, and it's called, oh my gosh, it's rallying. Now, I should have wrote it down or write down a note right now. It's called rallying. This is so fascinating to me. And I actually think that God designed this into the whole dying process, right? Where Cheryl's mom, like that was it, right? And then all of a sudden, she started getting better. She started rallying so much so that the nurse kind of warned us about this rallying. What's rallying? I'm like, okay, this is a new term for me. Well, rallying is when you kind of come back up, you're kind of got your wits about you, we're talking to her, and then all of a sudden, you go right back to where you were, and then death occurs. I actually believe that whole purpose is so that the individual can become reconciled to God. It's an opportune time to give the gospel, to ensure, just not because they sat in our church house, that doesn't mean they're a Christian, they accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And number two, to be reconciled to broken relationships before you move off. That's the chance for that person to kind of close those doors, not be prideful, and to kind of make things right before they head to the other side, whether it's home with the Lord or not home with the Lord. And then the final fifth one is that the patient autonomously requests, again, goes to the principle of autonomy, right? Putting something in place, right, that you have prepared. There's action, and that's if it's possible, right? Sometimes people can do it in a forward thinking or not, but even then, go back to the first four principles and just kind of noodle through these things. So I hope those guidelines are at least helpful. Now, in order to help you kind of really noodle through these things, I'm going to give you a couple resources, a couple books. Great thing to ask for Christmas or for stocking stuffers. So there's The Spiritual Brain. So this is an unbelievable book. I think it's just so fascinating on how the mind and and the body interact. There's tons of things with PET scans and stuff. It's just fascinating, right? And it just kind of really gives you a great apologetic to build up your faith in that area. It's really cool. And the other one is Christianity and Bioethics. This is actually an updated edition from Dr. Mark Foreman. He was part with Dr. Geisler in my bioethics class. And this is kind of his sweet spot. It's a wonderful book. It's into all the different principles and so forth, and then deals with all these tough issues. Great book, great resource. Again, just to have to read to dog ear. So he even gets into specific types of equipment and stuff. And that's outside my lane, right? But don't be stuck on it and try to make decisions when it's really tough in its emotions. I don't know about you, but I don't make my best decisions when I'm emotional, whether it's a positive emotion or a negative emotion. And then there's a couple other resources. So I use evolutionnews.org. That is a intelligent design website that really anything that's in the news, it pops up and you start seeing these headlines pop there. They'll have some amazing people. There's a conglomerate of folks, and there's an amazing neuroscientist on there, neurosurgeon who I love. He's just incredible talking about a lot of these types of issues, but there's all kinds of issues that pop up. The other one is abortionno.org. I think as soon as you pop there, it gives you the warning. And if wombs had windows, I think that issue would end itself. And then finally, I just want to point out to you my blog, oneyearbiblesite.wordpress.org. I have on there my religious exemption to the current vaccines. And I talk about other vaccines that are on the market and coming out that are more of a classical approach. I think it's important just to read it, no matter where you landed on an issue. Some of you might have just said, "Oh, I heard the word vaccine, go get it. I got vaccines." Friends, I have more stuff in my body than most people on this call because of my work. I've been all over the place. But this one just caused me to check a little bit. And I did a bunch of research, and I used some of these principles. I have the charts in there, at least kind of go through my thinking, especially if you start thinking about boosters or other things. It's just an important thing to do. I think there's a lot of ignorance out there on purpose, and a lot of pompousness from folks who speak on the tube and from government entities. And I introduced you to the footnotes, are probably the most useful, more than my information. Introduce you to Brownstone Institute and others. We can at least see the other side. There's got to be a debate about these things so that you can then sift through your own personal situation and say, "Hey, I think that works for me." There's no yes or no on this. I wish I can give you that, but plow through the principles and make a decision and really think through it biblically and prayerfully. That's all that you are required to do before the Lord. And you'll land in different places, but please don't virtue signal on people who land in different positions. Just think through it. That's all that's asked. And don't try to force people to make the decision that you yourself have made. There's a difference between biblical restriction and personal conviction. So that would be a matter of personal conviction. So kind of our group time. I hope that, again, I was skimming across the water. My goal was modest, was just to kind of introduce some principles and stay in my lane and just give you resources to equip you to think through some of these things. So a couple questions. I was like, how does viewing the human person as created in the image of God, where God is sovereign over life, inform these medical decisions? It's just a different way of looking at it. And how much have you caught from the culture? Do you really believe that we have a soul? Do you really believe that? The other one is, how does the fact, this is not a theory, this is a fact, that most of the current medical doctors, current media, current people in my field and all of our fields, current folks, all right, grew up with these seminaries of secularism, and their nurses are trained in a post-Christian, secular humanist, neo-Marxist worldview. How does that impact our relationship as Christ followers of Jesus Christ, who's to renew our mind and put our entire life experiences through that gospel framework? How does that impact our trust of their advice at critical moments? I think at least should cause us to pause and ask good questions, especially when someone cannot speak for themselves.